Three friends end up at a cabin with their partners for their yearly visit. But this year, things take a crazy turn to highlight their already messed up lives. Peter introduces himself and his friends Dave and George in excitement. He is attending a therapy session with Dr. Gordon and just wants to set the scene for the whole story. He explains that something has happened, and it has to do with the cabin. This is the same cabin he goes to with his friends every summer to drink and have fun. This is also where he claims George tried to murder him. To explain this part, he starts from the beginning of the story, when everything began on the day of Steve's Halloween party. The three friends discuss what they will turn up as for the party, and ask Peter if he asked out the mystery girl yet. In his office, Susie is annoyed while talking to her father. Peter keeps looking at her with love, and tries to ask her nervously to be his date to the party. He ends up just informing her about it instead, and she wishes him luck. She then gets another call while Peter gets busy with work. George explains that asking someone out is all about confidence, and tries to give him a demo. He sits next to a woman on a bench, and somehow convinces her to go out with him. Peter is mind-blown and doesn't understand how that worked. They discuss how George has broken up again, and cannot hold on to a relationship longer than a month. George then notices something and insists he has some business to attend to. Peter has decided he will ask Susie out for real this time. They are both confused, though, about her talking to George. Susie seems to be taken by George, and despite just meeting him, agrees to go to the Halloween party that night with him. Peter doesn't believe she knows George, and is speechless when he learns she is going on a date with him. Peter pretends he is glad to hear this, and George comes up to him to insist that he should ask out the mystery girl, just like he did. He then leaves with Susie, but Dave still convinces Peter to go to the party. At the party, Peter declares he wants to leave within 5 minutes, once he notices Susie and George making out. Dave insists George and Susie will not last, since they know how George is with girls. Dave also thinks Peter should check out other women at the party. Nancy, who is sitting behind Peter, asks who they are staring at. Peter informs Dr. Gordon that this is the first time he met Nancy, who almost didn't come to the party. This is because her friend Mary had to go to the hospital last minute that day. We see a flashback where Nancy begs her to come, but Mary has to take care of their friend. Nancy doesn't want to go without her, but Mary convinces her to have fun and inform her about it later. Back at the party, Peter explains that he is wondering when Susie and George will come up for air. Nancy knows Susie from her building, and comments on how pretty she is. Peter agrees, but turns back to look at Nancy, and insists she is prettier. They formally introduce each other, and Peter offers to get her a drink. A drunk Dave is amused by Nancy's ladybug costume and wants Peter to forget about Susie, since he feels Nancy is much better. When Dave leaves, Nancy feels he would be perfect for her friend Mary. Nancy knows Peter is pining for Susie, but Peter insists he had a great time with her. He kisses her, and Nancy invites him over. 4 years later, Peter comes late from work and apologizes to Nancy, who looks very upset. He notices a packed bag and wonders if they are going on a trip. Nancy then conveys she is not happy with their relationship and wants them to separate. The bag she has packed is for Peter to leave the house. Peter mentions their successful sessions with Dr. Gordon and how things seem to be improving. Nancy tries to say something, but Peter cuts her off. She doesn't want to explain further and just asks him to leave. Peter picks up the suitcase, but is frustrated when he steps out. He meets Dave at the bar and rants about Nancy kicking him out. Dave feels Peter should give her some time to cool off. While talking, he keeps checking his watch, since he has to meet Mary and her parents later. Peter is not happy, but lets him leave to be with Mary. George is happily watching Friends at home when Susie comes to talk to him. She feels that since they have been together for 4 years, they need to discuss what's next in their relationship. George conveys that he doesn't believe in marriage or having kids. He then gets paranoid about the possibility of Susie poking holes in his condoms, which Susie finds very weird. George claims he is a very sexual being, confesses that he is bored of Susie sexually, and suggests a threesome. Susie has had enough and feels like she has a lot to think about. Dave and Mary are happy and in love, but Dave keeps getting calls from Peter. They discuss how sad it is that Nancy and Peter aren't back together yet, and wonder how they can help them. Mary then gets an idea to bring them together by letting them both know that the other is not coming to the cabin next month. Dr. Gordon notes how his friends tricked him, and Peter finds it amusing. Mary talks to Nancy and tries to convince her to come to the cabin. Dave does the same with Peter. Nancy hasn't seen Peter in months and doesn't feel comfortable. Mary assures her that Peter will not come to the cabin, since he has other plans. Dave tells Peter the same thing, and when he mentions Susie will be there, Peter lights up and agrees to come. After the call, Mary and Dave check with each other and feel they are doing the right thing. Peter explains to Dr. Gordon that it was all set up, and even Susie was back together with George after their fight. Susie overhears George talking on the phone, and he explains that Peter and Nancy have been tricked into coming. Susie wants to be alone with him for the weekend, but George wants to see Peter after a long time and promises to take a romantic trip with her later. Mary asks Dave to hurry, but he is taking out a ring box to pack for the cabin. He informs his mom he is going to propose that weekend. Mary hears a part of the conversation, and when she asks him about it, he lies, which makes her suspicious. Peter reaches the cabin, followed by George and Susie. Peter tries to greet Susie, but she walks away from him. George asks Peter what he did, since Susie has been acting weird all day. Inside the cabin, Susie gratefully accepts wine from Dave, but gets up when Peter comes up next. George is excited to be with the boys again for the weekend. Peter chases after Susie while George and Dave discuss how he doesn't know Nancy is coming. In his room, Dave makes sure his ring is in the suitcase. George is watching Friends when Susie wants to know where their suitcase is. Susie reaches Dave's room to pick it up, but takes Dave's suitcase instead, which looks similar to George's. Peter wants to discuss what happened, but Susie has decided to ignore him. Dave asks Mary where their suitcase is, and she remembers it was on the ground. She's about to open the pocket where Dave thinks the ring is, but he stops her and asks her to go on a walk instead. George gets ready for his run when Steve from work stops him and asks about the cabin. George insists it is just for the couples, and maybe he can join them next year. Dave and Mary are walking hand in hand and try to say something to each other. Mary seems stressed and heads inside to start on dinner. Susie peeps in and asks if Peter is there. She wants to discuss something personal with Mary about Peter. While Dave is practicing his proposal, Peter creeps up on him and tries to discuss something. He makes Dave swear he will not reveal anything to Mary or George. He reminds Dave of the crush he had on Susie before she met George. Susie explains to Mary that a few weeks ago, she got into a fight with George. She reveals that she carries around a wedding book with her all the time, because she has expectations, but is disappointed because George doesn't believe in marriage. She then informs her that on the night of their fight, she left the house and went to the bar. Peter also explains how he visited the bar very often when Nancy left him. Then Peter and Susie explain to Dave and Mary separately how they met one night at the bar after the fight, when Peter bought Susie a drink and they sat down to talk. They didn't want to be alone, so outside the bar, Susie kissed Peter and he invited her over. While Peter remembers the sex they had as a wonderful experience, Susie thought it was awful. After that night, the old feelings all came back for Peter, and he is in love again, while Susie thinks of it as a huge drunken mistake and knows that Peter has fallen for her. Peter feels like he can convince Susie to dump George and be with him, but Dave reveals he cannot do anything like that, since he is planning to propose to Mary. After hearing that, Peter agrees to delay his plan for a while. But Mary feels Susie has to talk to Peter that night itself, and confirm that she has no intention of ever being with him. When Peter enters, Susie insists they need to talk, and Peter suddenly forgets his promise to Dave. Just then, George comes in, ushering Nancy into the cabin, which comes as a huge surprise to Peter and Nancy. Dave and Mary then admit it was their plan to get them together to talk things out. Peter and Mary start bickering while Susie starts enjoying the fight. Nancy is hurt Mary did this, even after she discussed a few things about Peter with her. Mary admits bringing them together wasn't a great idea. Peter and Nancy discuss which one of them should leave the cabin, and he rudely asks Nancy to drive safely back. George declares no one is going home, since the last ferry has left. Peter still tries to find some way to leave, but Nancy insists that she feels they can survive one weekend in the same house without murdering each other. Dave then smooths things over and invites everyone for dinner. They all eat dinner at the table in awkward silence, which Peter breaks to compliment Mary's cooking. When he comments on how he hasn't had a home-cooked meal in a while, Nancy knows that is a taunt directed at her. Peter dodges her question, and Dave tries to smooth things out again by asking George and Susie about their trip to Bermuda. They all start making awkward statements, and Nancy comments on how good it feels to finally take a vacation. Peter knows this is directed at him, and insists he did take her on vacations. Since it gets more awkward, Dave bursts out laughing. Amid the awkwardness, Susie directly asks Nancy and Peter when they are planning to get back together. Nancy takes this as a cue to announce that she needs to lie down, and Mary follows her to show her the room. Mary apologizes for what happened, but after a while, they both start laughing at how awkward the dinner was. Peter wants Dave to know how uncomfortable it was for him. Dave was hoping they would cordially talk to each other and sort things out. Peter still feels what he told Dave in the morning stands, and that Nancy and he aren't getting back together. Nancy also can't stand Peter and his attempts at taunts. Mary then shares that she feels Dave is cheating on her, since he is being secretive and distant. Nancy assures her that Dave loves her, and there must be some other reason for his weird behavior. Mary knows she's right and discusses her plan of seducing Dave that night. Susie is going through the suitcase and finds Dave's ring. She mistakenly thinks it's from George, and gets very excited. When he bangs on the door, she says yes to whatever he wants to ask her that weekend. George joins in on the excitement too and swings her around. He insists he has an idea for later. Susie asks George to make sure Nancy and Peter get back together and find their spark. Peter comes to talk to Nancy and apologizes. He wants them to be civil, since they are stuck with each other for the weekend, and Nancy agrees. Dave enters his room and calls out to Mary, who has a surprise from him. Dave tries to check for the ring, but it's nowhere to be found. He panics and grabs Peter to talk to him. He takes Peter to his own room by mistake, and they come across Mary dressed in lingerie. Dave drags him out by the ear and requests Peter to help him find the ring. George is enjoying Friends in the living room while Nancy reads a book. Peter comes looking for a ring box and asks them about it. George asks him to sit down and starts a conversation between them. He encourages them to discuss what went wrong, and Nancy reveals their spark has gone. George explains that he can help them get the spark back and suggests a threesome. He then leans over to kiss Nancy, who is shocked by the gesture, but not as shocked as Peter. Nancy can't go along with it and feels it has been a while, and nervously goes to her room. George sighs and insists he tried to do what Susie asked. Peter is confused, but George explains that Susie wants him to get Peter back with Nancy. He then discusses with Peter how strange Susie has been acting lately and asks him to go talk to her outside. Peter gets excited and hugs George for his encouragement. Susie is obsessed with the ring and hides it when Peter sits next to her. Susie explains that the night they spent together was a mistake, but Peter looks back on how great it was. George then comes out to ask them if they need drinks. When he goes back, Peter confesses that George wants him to find out what's wrong with her. Susie insists she loves George and wants to be with him. Peter gets upset and is unable to explain anything to George. Mary is failing at seducing Dave, who is pretending to frantically search for his toothbrush. Mary highlights the effort she has made and insists Dave needs to join her. Dave pauses his search for a bit, but is still distracted trying to find the ring, while Mary tries her move on him. In his room, Peter writes a letter about how much he can't stop thinking about Susie, and wants her to meet him on the patio when everyone is asleep. He drops the note off in Susie's room. He is waiting with chocolate-covered strawberries on the patio when he hears someone approaching. Nancy spots the decorations and feels that Peter has done it for her. Peter invites her to join him and plays along. Nancy is impressed by how romantic he suddenly is, and Peter insists he was waiting for the right time. He pours out wine for her, and they toast to unexpected surprises. George enters the room with Susie in excitement, and gets down on one knee to ask her to have sex with him. Susie thinks he is playing around, and asks if he lost something. She takes out the ring from her drawer and shows it to him. She apologizes for stealing it away in excitement, and happily declares that she will marry him. George is confused, and directly informs her that it is not his ring. Susie claims she found it in his bag, but after checking, George confirms it must be Dave or Peter's bag. He thinks they are in for a surprise if they have his bag. Susie is angry because she knows he will never ask her to marry him. George repeats that he made it very clear he doesn't believe in marriage. Susie then walks towards her desk and starts reading the note from Peter, while George explains how he doesn't want to be like Peter and Nancy, who started hating each other after marriage. Susie then leaves the note and walks out of the room. Susie enters Peter's room and calls out to him. Meanwhile, Peter is enjoying wine with Nancy and having a good time. Peter kisses her and discusses the time George wanted to go skinny dipping. They laugh, and Nancy remembers the good times they had in the cabin. Peter jogs her memory about a lot of nights they spent together. Peter flirts with her and hopes this is one of their many dates to come. Dave gets up in the middle of the night, pretending to go for a drink. Mary is suspicious, so she opens the suitcase to check what Dave didn't want her to see. Since she doesn't know it is George's suitcase, she finds a lot of sex toys. Peter and Nancy reach her room, and she asks him to wait while she changes. Mary comes out of her room and asks Peter about why Dave seems to be acting weird. Peter still pretends to not know what is going on, and assures her that Dave should be back soon. Mary is not satisfied with Peter's reply, and goes down the stairs to look for Dave. Peter enters his room and finds Susie trying to seduce him. She knows he was right about her not being happy with George, and now she wants to be with him. Peter feels like this is very bad timing. George is pacing in his room and finds the letter Peter left for Susie. In his room, Peter is trying to run away from Susie, but she convinces him that she wants to be with him, since George will never ask her to marry him. Peter gives in and kisses Susie, which his therapist doesn't approve of. Peter tries to justify his actions to his therapist, and feels like he didn't mean to hurt anyone. George reads the letter in his room and cries. While making out, Peter and Susie hear someone at the door, and Peter explains it must be Nancy. He insists that he prepared a romantic setup for Susie, but when she didn't show up, he started talking to Nancy and invited her. He requests Susie to hide in the bathroom for a while. When he opens the door, he finds George instead, who seems very happy to see Peter, and confesses that he has read the letter. Peter starts apologizing, but George is glad, and feels like things are great between them. He then leans forward to kiss Peter, and Peter realizes that George thought the letter was for him. Peter feels this is a huge mistake, even as George tries to seduce him and take off his clothes. When George approaches Peter again, Nancy knocks on the door, and he insists that George needs to hide. George feels like he is in for a threesome, but Peter convinces him to hide under the bed. Peter opens the door for Nancy, who is excited to spend the night with him. Peter tries to pretend that he has a cold, but Nancy walks in and starts kissing him on the bed. George then emerges from under the bed and informs Nancy that Peter is in love with him. Peter tries to assure Nancy that there is an explanation for this. Susie also decides to come out of the bathroom and asks Peter what Nancy is doing in his bed. Nancy is equally confused to see what she is doing in her husband's room. George still feels Peter loves him and shows Nancy the note he wrote. Nancy takes one look at the note and knows Peter wrote it for Susie, and all the strawberries were for her too. Nancy walks off in anger, and when Susie asks if he was going to sleep with Nancy, Peter tries to blame it all on too many drinks. While Susie and Peter argue about if he actually loves her, George puts his shirt back on with a serious look. He tells Peter he will murder him for sleeping with his girlfriend. As Nancy walks out of the room crying, Dave, who is looking for the ring in the living room, asks her if she is okay. Nancy hugs him and starts crying. Mary comes back in and spots Dave and Nancy hugging. Peter and George also come out running, and there is total chaos. Mary feels like Dave is cheating on her with Nancy, and is furious. George also accidentally hits Dave while trying to chase Peter. While George is furious that Peter slept with his girlfriend, Susie is disgusted that George tried to sleep with Peter. He explains that he doesn't like labels, while Dave scolds Peter for not listening to him earlier. Mary also feels Dave is a hypocrite, since she thinks he is cheating. George then wants to know whose engagement ring he has, and Peter is relieved he found it. Susie for a moment feels like Peter was going to ask her to marry him, but is in for disappointment. Dave asks everyone to calm down, and knows George will not actually murder Peter. He turns to Mary and confesses how much he loves her, and could never think of cheating on her. He reveals that the ring is his, since he planned to propose to her that weekend. Mary is still confused about everything she saw, but when Dave gets down on one knee and asks her to marry him, she is thrilled. Peter tries to apologize to Nancy, but she is done. When Susie is about to leave too, George tells her he forgives her. Susie doesn't want his forgiveness, since she is angry he tried to sleep with Peter. George doesn't want to hear anything Peter has to say. Peter remembers the time he and Nancy were young and in love. Dave and Mary are happier than ever, now that they are engaged. Susie takes off her dolphin earrings, which is what George calls her, and remembers the good times she had with him. Peter tries to sneak out in the morning, but is caught by Dave, who insists that he doesn't hate him. Peter apologizes for punching him, and when Mary comes in, she is cordial with him too. Peter congratulates them, and knows he won't be popular at the wedding but hopes to be invited. He is sorry about what he did with George, Susie, and Nancy. Nancy's car isn't starting, and she is frustrated, because the tow company can't come till Monday. Peter offers to drive her to the city, unless she wants to be stuck there. She reluctantly agrees, and reveals that she was trying to sneak out early too. They discuss how great it is for Mary and Dave, and when Peter tries to apologize again, she stops him. He then drives her home. Some time has passed, and Dave is leaving to meet Peter for lunch. At lunch, Peter wants to know if George is coming, and is touched since he sent him a very nice birthday card. He recounts his meeting with Nancy after the cabin, where he brought her flowers, but she directly informed him she is seeing someone else who is nothing like him, and wants to find out where it goes. Dave feels bad, but Peter seems to be talking about personal growth after his sessions with the Dr. Gordon, which impresses Dave. Peter also explains that he tried dating Susie for a while after the cabin, but found out they were very different. So now she is dating an actual prince of a European country, and got the fairytale wedding she wanted. George then comes in with excitement, and announces he is bringing his partner to Dave's wedding, and is now openly gay. Peter reveals he tried dating another young woman who felt like he lacked maturity, so she left him. He also doesn't have a job, since he disappeared for 2 weeks, or a place to stay, and asks Dave if he can stay with him and Mary. Dave initially tries to be nice, but directly informs him that Mary doesn't like him. George offers to let Peter stay with him while his boyfriend is away, and declares that he still loves him after their kiss. This is the point where Peter knows he has hit rock bottom, with no partner, job or apartment, and with Nancy filing for divorce. He then tries to turn his life around by getting a tiny apartment to start with, taking a job with his old company, which was Susie's old job, and hoping for the best. Dr. Gordon asks how things are, and Peter insists everything is great, after Dave and Mary got married and he was forced to be in the kitchen throughout. Dr. Gordon feels like Peter has been through a lot, but wants to know what he has learned from his journey. Peter declares he is in love with Nancy, and is working to get her back. Dr. Gordon is confused by his behavior, especially when Peter insists that he will crash Nancy's wedding and get her to dump the new guy to be with him instead.